Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to class. Today we are going to talk about significant studies in language variation. As we have been talking about throughout the module about important developments and emergence of social linguistics as a discipline and works by various founding fathers of social linguistics. But we all know that the variationist tradition, as we refer to this kind of language analysis, linguistic study, was started by William Lebov with his Martha Vineyard Island study, followed by New York study, and later on, AAVE, Afro-American Vernacular English Studies, and he set the principles, parameters, approaches, methods, and he started a new mode and a new method of analyzing language, establishing linguistic structures, the relationship between linguistic structures and social structures. And it did not stop with him. In fact, it was followed all over, and multiple significant studies were done in different parts of the world, specifically in England and in America. But we're not going to talk about all of these variation studies, but a few of them gave a better understanding with little variation in the method itself. However, they were all located within the purview of classical Lebovian framework. So today we are going to talk about the variationist tradition and some significant variation studies in linguistics. We have been talking about the emergence of social linguistics. We had a detailed discussion on that, how it emerged. It did not emerge out of blue, and we know that 18th, 19th century had historical linguistics and construction of Proto-Indo-European language as the major thrust. We also saw structuralism emerging in the first quarter of 20th century that continued up to almost half of the century, and then emergence of new paradigms and new theoretical approaches in linguistics. But from philology to dialectology and to social linguistics, we have a continuum. So social linguistics did not emerge out of blue, but it was extension and expansion of what we call dialectology earlier. If you go by the term dialectology and the technique and methods used in dialectology, it was a study of language in relation to dialects from regional angle. Such studies helped us in making language atlases. It began in 19th century and called dialectal geography or dialect geography, whatever you call it, subdiscipline of a linguistic. However, it did not focus on the social aspect of language. That was the difference. It focused purely on the structural part of it, the use part of it, the variation part of it, and these dialectal variations were recorded. Then we see that 1960s saw a departure in dialectology, where people like Lebov, people like Joshua Fishman, people like Charles Ferguson, people like Del Hams, people like Emeka Halliday, people like Basil Bernstein, right? People like Ellen Grimshaw, people like Einar Hugen, people like Suzanne Irwin Tripp, people like Uriel Wenrich. So these people were interested in looking at uh, language as a social object, and language analysis was deeply rooted in socio-cultural perspective. And from there, we have a beginning of a new method in linguistics and emergence of a new discipline. It starts with study of William Lebov and variation studies. Now we all speak a language, but the question is, do we speak the same language in the same way? It differs in terms of individual. Sometimes we have idiosyncrasies, we have idiolects. We all speak, for example, I speak English and many other people speak English, but do we speak in the same way? Uh, Apart from that, uh, do I speak in the same way a group of people speak at a different level? Do I belong to a class which speaks English in a different way? So variations have multiple levels of manifestations. We vary in terms of pronunciation and accent. We vary in terms of choice of words. We vary in terms of morphological choices and morphological differences. We vary in terms of selection of sentences, types of sentences, right? Sentence structures. We vary in terms of a style of a speech. We may have different conversation style. So variation is at multiple level. But in all these variation studies, what we find common is that these variations have corresponding influence on social structures and vice versa. Social structures have corresponding representation in linguistic structures. So such studies, established a connection between social structure and linguistic structure, and it was done systematically, very methodologically, and we can call it, a quantificational study of speech because they were quantified. For example, Lebov used discourse to discuss his findings. So we will quickly focus on, I'm not going to go into detail of each of these studies, but I have selected a few important studies like Cardiff, like Belfast, like Detroit, right, like Martha Vineyard Island, like New York. So we will focus on these important studies. However, this list is not exhaustive, and you can find a lot of important studies done all over the world, including India. So I have only included a few early variation studies, but it continues till date. Now, variation is not random, we need to understand, and at the same time not arbitrary in nature. I mean, I cannot decide to speak English in my own way. I have to follow certain restrictions while I speak English. I may have my own style of speaking, but these restrictions are there, right? I cannot pronounce a word the way I want to, right? I cannot use a noun the way I want to. I cannot, change the categories of the word while I speak. So the speech is restricted, and the variations have restrictions in them. So we all speak in a particular linguistic outline. We don't go beyond that, and within that we have multiple levels of variation. So while the diversity of variation is huge, there are restrictions on variation, and such variations have patterns and consistent in a particular speech community. Such linguistic variation can be attributed to differences in social characteristics of the speakers and the community they belong to while using the language. So they can relate to, or they are related to, let's say, age group, certain age group, right? Like, old people have their own style of speaking, and you find it is different from speech of the young generation, right? Gender may play a role. The way men of different age groups speak may differ to certain extent in some aspects. The way women across the age groups speak, it can refer to class. We have class variations. A particular social class may be using language in a particular style, and the hierarchy of class, social stratification can be uh, paralleled with linguistic structures. So they may be having certain variants which are particular to that particular class. Similarly, geographical location, a region in which it is spoken across the classes. Uh, we may have socio-cultural background of the speaker. Of course, identity issues are there, and in order to demonstrate solidarity, we follow certain variations to register our membership with the group or with the community. So it all happens, and with all these parameters and indices of variations, we do believe that these variations have a pattern. These variations are consistent with all these social categories. Moving on, in variation studies in linguistics, we talk about sociolinguistic variables. It's very important for a researcher to identify sociolinguistic variable. We cannot randomly decide upon a certain sound or a certain pattern and believe it to be a representation of variation. We have to cautiously, consciously, and very meticulously select such sociolinguistic variables which may represent a particular social class, a particular social structure, and we are able to establish a correlation between social structure and linguistic structure. So it becomes very important for the researcher to choose an appropriate and important significant sociolinguistic variable. Lebov specifies the ideal sociolinguistic variable to be high in frequencies. You have to see the variable you are choosing must be high in frequency in speech of the target population. Similarly, it has to have a certain immunity from conscious suppression. So that means, the user of this variety, right, has it as a normal, regular, unmarked form. So it's not suppressed under certain, contextual limitations and constraints. Similarly, it has to be an integral part of the larger structure. It's not isolated. It's prolific, productive, and important part of regular linguistic structures, and it has to be you know uh, easily quantifiable on a linear scale, so that you can count it, you can quantify it. So these are the characteristics of an effective, important sociolinguistic variable that Lebov defines. So as a researcher or as a person in the field, you need to identify these sociolinguistic variables, and you need to define your mechanism, your methodology. You need to prepare and do a little homework before you go for data collection. We have done videos on sociolinguistic variables. We have done videos on observer's paradox. These two things are very important in uh, quantificational study of language, where we are talking about variation in language, and in variationist tradition, Lebov himself defined observer's paradox and sociolinguistic variables. We have to keep these constraints in our mind when we go for variable studies. We have already talked about Lebov's work. However, it's important to quickly go through the trigger, the study that triggered this new approach in quantificational study of speech, which we call linguistic variation, sociolinguistic variation, and it is also known as variationist tradition. It all starts with Martha Vineyard's study by Lebov, which took place from 1961 to 1963. Now, Lebov studied the variation in diphthongs. He identified diphthongs, combination of two vowels, as a sociolinguistic variable in the speech of Martha Vineyard Island inhabitants. The pronunciation of the diphthong varied in community and it was called linguistic variable. We will come to know why and how. He maintained a very informal contact with his respondents. He wanted to record natural speech. So he had to mingle with the population there. He was not an insider, but he contacted them and came close to them. You need to remember that it's very important to have natural speech when you are recording, when you are collecting data. And in order to ensure natural speech, this is where he talks about observer's paradox, that your presence, let's say tape recorder, and the setting becomes intimidating and hostile to your respondent. And your respondent may be conscious, and then the whole exercise fails because you are not able to get the natural data. So he used multiple techniques to inspire them and to suppress such external elements like his presence, like the tape recorder, and this the tape recording generated consciousness in the minds of the respondents. He used a scoring system for his analysis, and the interviews were divided into age groups, for different age groups. He recorded 69 tapes for the purpose, and he classified them, transcribed them, classified them, analyzed them by giving a scores, and he used a statistical method to get the results. Now, if you look at the explanation, what was the outcome of this study, a big factor to consider when discussing the causes of these differences in pronunciation in Martha Vineyard Island may be reduced to attitude of the inhabitants. Now, you have to understand the background. Martha Vineyard Island was a small populated island which would be visited by multiple summer visitors. Many summer visitors would visit this island, which was not very much liked by the inhabitants of the island, because they considered them to be intrusion in their life, their language, their culture. And such variations may be seen as a protest against those visitors, and a sense of others, we versus others, So it refers to the linguistic attitude, and the inhabitants of the island were very particular about sounding different from rest of the visitors on the island. And this attitude continued in the middle-aged group, who looked at themselves as the custodian of the language and culture of the island. So that's very important. So a high degree of centralization in the diphthongs that was chosen by Lebov as a linguistic variable shows belonging to the island and resistance against the summer people. Young people were still somewhat ambiguous and therefore do not have such a strong centralization. But they were moving towards centralization. Right? They were young and they were mostly unaware of such undercurrent and resistance. People of the age group of 13 to 45 probably have recently made experiences which led to centralization of the diphthongs. And with a conscious, deliberate effort in this age group that wanted to sound different. Centralization indicates islander status, loyalty, and solidarity, as I said, you know. So it was a signal of demonstrating loyalty to the island, and it worked as an undercurrent and protest against the visitors of summer. So these variables are so loaded, we need to understand, right? So it was not a simple variable. The tight-knit community subconsciously ensured that they created a linguistic divide between them and us. So in order to sound different, look different and sound different, this was a deliberate attempt to use this variable in their speech continuously and consciously. And this study shows that generations, occupations, social groups might be a big factor in language use as a socio-linguistic consideration. And it was a landmark study by Lebov, and it marked the beginning of a new approach in quantificational study of speech and studying language variation. Another major work which influenced many in the field is Lebov's study of the varieties of English in New York City. And for that, he chose 3 departmental stores. And the selection of these 3 departmental stores in New York City was based on the kind of customers they would attract and the demographic differences of the customers. Like one was a high class, very expensive store. The other may be a store meant for targeting local and working class population. So the selection was made very meticulously, depending on the social class of the visitors of the store. And then he devised his own style of collecting data. The hypothesis was that the linguistic variable ra sound differentiates English in New York City in terms of status, so correlation with social class. In terms of style, correlation is with formality and informality. If the formality increases, the use of ra also increases. Like, he used to go and ask question like, where can I find a ladies' shoe? And the answer would be 4th floor. So you have 4th introvocalic sound there in the middle of the word, and floor, ra sound at the end of it, word final position. And he would pay attention to this sound. He would, record it and continue this exercise with multiple visitors in these stores. And so position of occurrence, like I told you, middle of the word or end of the word, and also age group, which is hypothesized as it is rather a feature of the younger generation. What deductions can we make out of it? Speakers who are ranked in a scale of social stratification will be ranked in the same order by their different use of this linguistic variable. And socioeconomic differences cannot be ignored in linguistic studies. So this study clearly established the fact that the social order corresponds to linguistic ordering of this variable. The social structure corresponds to linguistic structure. So these 2 studies, and also another study Lebov carried out was on Afro-American vernacular English among young speakers, black speakers. These studies established a new methodology, a new approach to look at speech in terms of quantification. So how can speech be quantified? How can we identify a social-linguistic variable? How can we collect data? What should be the approach in analyzing data? How to analyze data with assigning a scores, calculate them, and have deductions. So very completely elaborate methodology and approach was laid out by Lebov to be followed by many scholars in the field in future. And this is exactly what happened. Based on the model that Lebov produced, many other studies were replicated in different parts of the world, where Detroit, for example, Belfast, for example, Cardiff, for example, are of a special mention. And we'll quickly look at these studies in a very brief, right? So, Norwich, a very important study done by Peter Trudgill. It was done in Norwich, England in 1974. He used Levovian method, classical Levovian method, with his device structured interviews. He was himself from Norwich, a native of Norwich. So it was easy for him, unlike Lebov, it was easy for him to be an insider, connect with his respondents and get the inside information. He didn't have to struggle to get the social structure of Norwich because he was from that place and he knew the social structure. And some predictable results he was familiar with. So being insider of Norwich helped him a lot in analyzing his data and coming up with deductions. He was from Norwich and I told you he spoke Norwich accent himself. So it was very easy for him to connect with the respondent. So he chose one linguistic variable, nga sound, right, velar nasal, and he tried to see the manifestation of it, the representation of it in the speech of different social class with nga as a velar one or na as a dental one. So nga with two variants, na and nga, like singing, nga and nasal, and singing na at the end position. The findings of the study confirm the hypothesis that nga is used more often by high status people who are educated and aware of this and also very conscious of producing this. Na is used more often by the working class people who tend to be very casual and different from the high status people. So what are the outcome? Influence of a style differ according to the linguistic variable in question. The socioeconomic class of the speaker determines the use of this variable, and the particular style difference in question, like casual and formal, also determines occurrence of this variable in the speech of different people. So it was almost like replicating classical Levovian method, which he did in Norwich, Martha Vineyard Island and New York City, was replicated in Norwich by Peter Trudgill, done in 1974, and this remains one of the important, significant studies in language and variation. Moving on to the next study done by James Milroy and Leslie Milroy in Belfast. So this variation study was conducted by James Milroy and Leslie Milroy in 1980s. Majority of the fieldwork was done by Leslie Milroy, and she was accepted as a friend by the target group. So they maintained the same observer's paradox. They wanted to make sure that they're able to record the normal natural speech. So Leslie Milroy will visit and she would get another contact with the same friend, and then she would approach the other person as friend of a friend, and this is how she would specifically go to different respondents. And while doing field work, she came very close to the families she was targeting for her studies, and in some families she got access, very informal access. So that was not a problem for her to contact her respondents and get the natural speech. Belfast, she had you know two kinds of two types of areas, and one area had high level of unemployment among men, and such unemployment and lack of resources would also create a lot of social malaise and social problems. It was a problematic area. The other area was relatively better, and she conducted her survey in both the areas. Uh, you know, in the one area, some of the men would travel, far away to get the job, and these all figured in her deductions, because in her analysis and deductions, right? Uh, so these Milroys concentrated on the speech of working class people only in Belfast, and Leslie Milroy had a very easy access to the target group because of her social networking, and using that network, visiting the respondent as friend of a friend, that allowed them to have a normal natural speech. What was the outcome? The outcome was social network of speech and social correlates of variation in speech. So they established correlation between social network of speech and social correlates of variation in the speech of working class of Belfast. So Belfast study, that is very significant milestone study. You can get more about these studies if you refer to the actual report and analysis of Milroy's 1980s. Moving on to another very important and interesting study that was done by Nicholas Copeland in Cardiff, right, the capital of Wales in England. Uh, what was the hypothesis? The hypothesis was, do we speak differently to different people? So, do we customize our speech according to the communication partner? Do we accommodate, right? So, this was also developed as accommodation theory. Um, so, he found an assistant, and he designed his experiment, he designed his research in such a way that he wanted to have uh, a speaker who happens to, talk to different people with different socio-cultural background, socio-economic background, where one speaker remains constant and the other speakers change, to see how he or she interacts and communicates by making linguistic accommodations, social status accommodations, and class of the people. For that, he designed the experiment, and he found Sue, the lady who worked in a travel agency located in the heart of Cardiff, and she was an assistant working there. And because of her job required her to respond to many people from different social class, and a lot of people will visit her every day. She remained common in all such conversations, but other partner kept on changing because people from different backgrounds and social class would visit and talk to her. Copeland placed a microphone in front of the lady Sue, and which was not visible to the people who would visit her. But he got the consent of Sue. She understood the research design and the purpose of study, and she happily agreed. He placed the microphone there in front of her, and he would sit in a corner observing the visitors. They would come, but there was an ethical issue because he wanted the visitors to know that their speech is being recorded, but he would do it after the recording was done. So uh, once the conversation is over and the visitor or the customer goes out, he would approach the customer, apprise the customer about the design, and tell them that if you want part of the recording can be erased but thankfully most of them agreed to continue without erasing any of the part. And he would also talk to the customer in order to get the socio-economic background of the customer and all other demographic details. So this is how meticulously he recorded for days, and he got a sizable, body of recorded tape to transcribe and analyze. So this experiment continued, and in all the tapes, the voice of Sue will remain constant. Sue was the constant character in that all speech event, in those all speech events, and it was interesting to see that Sue would accommodate and try to match the status of the customer. Accommodate the style of the customer, of style of speaking, status of the customer, and she would accommodate and make changes in her communication patterns and speech. So, if you look at the outcome of this study, it verifies the accommodation theory in communication. It verifies the linguistic accommodation, matching a status with your communication partner, and all kinds of social accommodations in speech that Sue made. So that establishes the accommodation theory in communication. Then here in this talk, in this class, last but not the least, Detroit study. This is also a very interesting experiment. If you look at the design, it's very interesting. It was done by Penelope Eckert in early 1980s at a secondary school in suburban Detroit, USA, and she would call it Belton High. The population of the school was almost white population. So students were all from white class people, but it was sharply divided in two groups. It was highly polarized two groups. Majority of them belonged to either of the group, but some of them also treated themselves as moderators, and they identified with each other group according to their convenience. However, these two groups were very polarized. One group would call itself jocks and the other would call itself burnouts. So she observed 600 such students and recorded 118 interviews. Just for your reference, jocks were loyal to this school. They would derive their identity with this school. They would remain in the school from prime premises. They would study well. They would participate in sports and extracurricular activities. More or less, they were all good students of the school. They would identify themselves with this school. They would follow the rules of the school, and they were loyal to the school and its system. The other group was just opposite, burnouts. So that group had tendencies to defy the rules. They would run away from the school. They would get out of the school as early as possible. They would not stay in the school. They did not identify with schools. They would take drugs and all sorts of other unwarranted things they would do. And there was a high competition between these two groups. Now, this is the background of the design of experiment she carried out there. The outcome of the analysis emphasized that social parameters cannot be taken for granted. Social parameters like age, sex, like social class. Here was a different situation altogether. It was a local community of the school that displayed a remarkable variation in the social variation, linguistic variation, right? And this work by Penelope Eckert established that it is important to see how the local community is organized socially across all social categories that we talk about. You can continue looking at different variation studies done till date all over the world. But I wanted to sensitize you and mention Detroit study by, for example, I know Norwich study, for example, Belfast study, for example, right? Martha Vineyard Island, for example, New York study by Lebov, for example. So these are some specimen and very significant studies in language variation. But the foundations of language variation studies were laid with the work by Lebov in Martha Vineyard Island and New York survey. And this tradition or this style of doing linguistics is called variationist tradition. You can watch more to understand Lebov's idea and Lebov's framework of variation in our videos that we have done on Lebov. And this marks a new beginning in sociolinguistics. So 1960s, it's seen as a fertile time for a new subdiscipline to emerge, and these are the few studies that I have mentioned in this talk are a specimen. They are not exhaustive in nature. You can look at them separately, and you can also look at all around you. You might notice certain variation and changes in speech around you, and then try to see who are the people, their background, right? And try to see, do they follow the same parameter and pattern of the rest of the class, rest of the group, rest of the region, and how your speech is different from there. So this is all for you to see and observe all around you. This is it for now. Thank you very much.